pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
One more thing real quick. I gave a 15-minute speech today at the Temecula Valley Women's Republican Federated, and I was all jazzed because Congressman Ken Calvert and Congressman Duncan Hunter were in the audience. So I was able to give a quick, so I actually kind of joked during that, and I said, you know, I've always wanted to go to Congress and teach Congress the Constitution. Well, I've got 2 to start now today, so I'm good. I'm very excited because I get to start with 2 of you guys. And then they're kind of laughing. I said, now you guys will spread word what I taught you guys, right? You're going to tell the rest of Congress? Yeah. But anyway, Duncan Hunter, I really like him a lot. Ken Calvert, I tolerate him. He's a good Republican, not necessarily a good conservative. But he was receptive. He didn't used to like me. He acted like he liked me, so I have to give him that. Anybody need a Constitution? Everybody got your Constitution? Okay, good to go. All right, we're in Article 2 still. I got some new pins because all my pins I want to slap usually. And I want them in my other board pen. So I did wrong.
Oh, may I ask you something? My
Yes, ma'am.
husband, he can't come to this class because he uses a portable, what do they call it, oxygen machine.
You couldn't get up the stairs?
He can't get it up, it's too difficult to get up.
Oh, your husband?
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed he was at the bar last time. And
So he wanted to know if I can record the.
I've got a.
he puts it on YouTube.
Oh,
I
on
can-
YouTube?
yeah.
Oh, I
I
didn't know
can give
that.
you my YouTube name. It's
That way he can
sort
watch
of
it
long.
later.
You can use it.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm always better live, right?
Yeah.
But that's easy to, E-A-S-Y, easy to, it's all spelled out.
Caps or orbis,
It doesn't matter.
ASY, easy.
Well, I'm just gonna have to tell Dean it's time for him to put in an elevator.
Everything is spelled.
Okay.
I know, we pretty make it.
Escalator.
Yeah, it's Tedesco.
How about those little chairs that
No
zip us
chair,
up?
yeah.
E-C-T, et cetera, et
So
cetera.
next time I see Dean, I say, hey man, you're costing me students, man, you gotta put in an elevator.
Yes, E-T-R-I-C-K-S, E-C-T and E-C-T.
Any, what?
E-C-T for et cetera, and E-C-T for et cetera.
You guys been have a chance to listen to the radio shows? Cause I tell you what, the last 2 shows, I've been real happy with.
TC.
Really
Yeah,
good
that's
episodes.
I never did listen to this last week. Last week before I did.
I listened to it. I
The
have
one before
We gotta
last
go
week
somewhere.
was real interesting too. We had a
Because I have a
filmmaker,
channel
same
where
guy who was out there at the
I
Constitution
work in
Association
the
show the film.
And
then,
but on
And then I had
Tuesday nights, when
a
it
private
comes to
investigator
live,
who's done work with FBI and all that jazz.
Yeah.
And then last week, Double X called in and we talked not about QAnon as much as a few other things that have been going on out there. But Dennis didn't call in, but it was just me and Alex. But I was kind of on ball. I had 3 constitutional topics I kind of went after. I tell you what, as a constitutionalist, usually in the news, it's hard for me to find a good constitutional topic. I mean, I find stuff that they're idiots about, but constitutional topics kind of hard. Boy, I tell you what, lately the Democrats have been feeding me this stuff. I mean, it's so easy to, it amazes me how much they hate the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll come right out and say it.
That's because it limits them.
It limits them. It's an obstacle to what they want to do. Yes,
On
sir.
Republic Broadcasting Network, there's Road Warrior, Chris Hinckley. You ever heard of that? Chris
I've
Hinckley.
heard of Chris Hinckley.
I spoke on his show today.
It's like Josie.
I called in, yeah. And he lets you talk. You can go on. And so I talked about cybernetics.
Well, that's one of the things that my guests usually like about me. Is I don't pull a Hannity where, I mean, I like Hannity, but, Hannity's interrupting his guest every, 3 words,
Disconnect.
I usually let my guests talk a little bit.
Yeah.
But anyway, I won't be on this Saturday. We're being preempted by football. I was supposed to be at Politicon, but the form that I got to fill out and send back by email, I lost, and I couldn't do it because of the crash of my computer. So I'm not going to be at Politicon because of my stupid computer. So that was another thing. So maybe the Lord has something else planned. I don't know. The Lord knows what's going on. Okay. Anyway, all right. Where we left off was we talked about Commander in Chief and war powers and all that, right? Remember that?
Yes.
Okay, but we really didn't get into the advice and consent powers. What am I looking for? It's already over here. So, and this actually is kind of appropriate considering Kavanaugh and all that jazz. So, let me put this on here first of all. So advise and consent. That's what it says Senate has as a power. Now, when people are asking me, well, gosh, with the Kavanaugh hearing and confirmation, were they really acting upon their advice and consent powers? Because it seemed like more like they were just being obstructionists.
Yeah.
So, well, technically the Senate can run their confirmation hearing any way they want. So if they want to be obstructionists, they can. The problem is not whether or not they were following protocol. The problem is who's there. Now I know what. Let me rephrase that because yeah, who's there? Cory Booker, Kamala Harris. That's enough right there to make you want to spit. But matter of fact, I told you about sending them their letters with the pocket constitutions, right?
Mhm.
Haven't gotten a response yet from them yet. I told Ken and Duncan about it, and I gave them theirs. And I said, I won't have to send you a letter. I won't, but please take these pocket constitutions. Here's my phone number, my email, my card. You got any questions? Give me a call. But our problem isn't what they were doing, it's who was there, and here's what I mean by that. U.S. Senate has these advised consent powers. The U.S. House of Representatives does not. The U.S. Senate is supposed to be different than the House. A whole different animal. And for those of you who've been with me a while, you know where I'm going with this. We're heading for the 17th Amendment, aren't we? Originally, the U.S. Senate was the voice of the states. It has become the voice of popular vote. Or should I say, democracy. And you know how much I love that word.
Why don't you just put the truth with socialism?
Well, democracy transitions us to that. We aren't there yet, but they're trying. They are trying. So our problem when it comes to advice and consent is to understand why advice and consent was given to the Senate in the first place. As the voice of the states, it makes sense. Here's why. Who's the parents over the federal government? States. Who's the final arbiters of the U.S. Constitution? States. Well, we the people in the states. States, or to the people is what it says in the 10th Amendment. But basically, states are the final arbiters, and the states are our voice. But we vote on who's that voice. But the reason why is because the states, no matter what ideology, no matter what party, their biggest concern is going to be their interest. Right? So if the senators were appointed by the state legislatures, and the Senate, as they originally were, and the senators' primary job was to keep the state legislature happy, their questions wouldn't have been going after Kavanaugh the way they did. First of all, they would have been like, how are you going to follow the Constitution and protect states' rights? Or at least that was the theory. What has happened is, this no longer exists. Doesn't. Because the senators are popularly voted in. The senators don't care about what the state wants, what's best for the state, what's the state's rights. They don't care. All they care about is their ideology, and they say they care about what the people think who voted them in. What they really care about is getting enough votes, and usually that's done by giving plenty of gifts to the voters. Promises of this type of program or that type of program. All right, so our problem is the right people aren't there. There should be representatives of the states who are appointed by the states there. That hearing would have been totally, think about how the questions would have been different. If the senator's largest concern was what is best for my state and what is best for the union, rather than their ideology. I really truly believe the 17th Amendment in 1913, when it changed it from the state to popular vote, introduced ideology into the Senate. Now, advice and consent means they give their advice and then they give their consent, majority vote. We got their consent. Barely, uncounted. That's what it's supposed to mean. But only the Senate has that power because the Senate was supposed to be the voice of the states. So the 17th Amendment has literally changed the whole dynamic of that whole thing. 17th Amendment drives me nuts, so you guys know that. All right. Now, they don't just have the advice and consent powers when it comes to nominations, but also to treaties. Well, once again, that makes sense. Did I tell you the story about Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase last week?
Oh, I
I've
didn't
told
know
it
about
before, but did I tell it last week? Okay, let's talk about that.
I think so.
All right, so in Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, I think, or 18, it basically says that in order for the federal government to own property, it has to, one, purchase that property, two, from, by consent of the state legislature involved, so consent of the state legislature involved, and three, for the purpose of needful buildings. Okay? And so there's this war going on in Europe, Napoleon, and Napoleon really needs money. And France owns this Louisiana territory. And Napoleon offers it to the United States. Thomas Jefferson is president. Thomas Jefferson's like, holy cow, we could double the size of the United States for a small chunk of change relative to what the land was worth ultimately. Problem was, federal government couldn't buy it. The federal government's only supposed to own land if it's purchased with the consent of the state need for buildings. Technically, what needed to happen is the states would have to get together and purchase Louisiana Purchase. And by the time, and well, it goes back to our thing last week when we were talking about, for God so loved the world, he didn't send a committee.
Mhm.
Can you imagine, states trying to, negotiate and put together committees, figure out, well, by the time they figured it out, the sale will be, lost. Jefferson knew it. So Thomas Jefferson's like, well, how do I purchase that for the United States without having to follow that? Well, that brings us to Article 6. So this is in Article 1, Section 8. In Article 6, we have the Supremacy Clause. And Supremacy Clause has 3 requirements for something to be supreme. Constitution, laws of the United States made pursuance of the Constitution. In other words, they're constitutional laws or treaties. Turn to Article 6 and we'll show you something about it real quick. I can't remember what page it is. Do you have the page?
15.
Yeah, that way you guys can, page 15, very, very bottom. It says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States made a pursuance thereof. See it? What's after the word thereof? What piece of punctuation? Semicolon. It's not just a comma, it's a semicolon. What that does is that separates these two from this when it comes to the made in pursuance thereof. Then it says treaties made or shall be made. Supreme law of the land, and it goes on to explain how the judges are supposed to follow that and how states cannot make laws contrary. And Jefferson got to looking at that and says, okay, so the Constitution and laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof have to be in pursuance of the Constitution, treaties don't. Well, now why would they leave it open for treaties not to have to be in pursuance of the Constitution? Who ratifies the treaties with their advice and consent powers? Senate. Who's the Senate? The voice of the states. If a treaty needed to be outside the Constitution for some reason, you would ask the parents, the final arbiters of the Constitution, if it's okay. Hence the reason why the Senate has that power. So what Thomas Jefferson did is he negotiated the sale, or the purchase, should I say, of the Louisiana Purchase through treaties. All of the negotiation was done through treaties. Senate ratified the treaties, so technically the sale was constitutional. So now that said, you can read about this if you. There's a Dumas Malone is his name. D-U-M-A-S Malone wrote a series of 6 books about Thomas Jefferson. They're really good. They're really accurate. I would suggest to read them if you get a chance. Matter of fact, a guy named Rick Crippen, who's a part of the Constitution Association, read all those books. And he comes back to me. He says, "Doug, 2 things I learned from those books." I said, "What's that?" So number 1, everything you said about Jefferson was accurate. Okay, cool. Number 2, there was more to Jefferson than I thought. I mean, the books are, really go into Jefferson deeply. And one of the things that they explain is that Jefferson went through his entire life regretting what he did. He played games with the Constitution when it came to the Louisiana Purchase. He was so desperate to get that he was willing to kind of play games, find a loophole, so to speak, and use treaties to purchase property when in reality, the federal government really couldn't. And it really haunted him the rest of his life. But that said, once again, it goes back to the advice of consent. Why are treaties not required to be in pursuance of the Constitution? Because the Senate has advice and consent powers over treaties. And the advice and consent powers are there because the Senate is supposed to be the voice of the states. Therefore, there's no worry. There's a worry if it isn't. When we get to the 17th Amendment in this class, I'm going to explain to you how the 17th Amendment not only was not properly ratified, but it actually was in defiance of Article 5 of the Constitution. In other words, it's an unconstitutional amendment, technically. We'll talk about that when we get to the 17th Amendment, though, because I want to continue on with what we're talking about. So, advice and consent, the problem isn't whether or not those senators were following the rules when it came to Kavanaugh. The problem is we got a bunch of turkeys in there because our Senate is not populated like it's supposed to be. Does that make sense? Someone says, "Yeah, but Doug, with California especially, you would still probably have the same knuckleheads there." Not necessarily, because when and I think I mentioned this last week, when the 17th Amendment was ratified, before it was ratified, the states also carried their system similar to the way the Senate was, in the sense that while the state legislatures were appointing the senators, the counties were appointing the state senators. The county lines were the Senate districts. So if the 17th Amendment had never been ratified, the states would probably to this day still be also following that the Senate districts are the county lines, which would give those lower population areas a bigger voice. And someone challenged me on something the other day, though, about the percentage. Way back long ago when I first started talking about this, like with Electoral College, for example, Rhode Island's voice in Electoral College is greater than it would be in a popular vote. And it used to be like a portion of 1% and like hundredths of 1%. Well, now it's not so drastic. In Electoral College, Rhode Island's voice is 0.5%. Without the Electoral College, it would be 1/3%. But still, their voice has a little bit greater, voice with Electoral College in place. With the Senate in place, too. You got two senators per state. It was so that the smaller states would have a voice. Well, the same thing at the states. Each county, that way, each county had one state senator. That way, each county had a voice, and the smaller counties had a greater voice in the whole. And if that was the case, we would probably have a Republican Senate and a Democrat Assembly in California, which I can deal with. If there's at least a fighting chance, I'm good with that. And probably through compromise, if they were still appointing the senators, we would probably have one Republican and one Democrat senator from California, just have a compromise. because the two houses would be split. So it would be a whole different animal, wouldn't it? The whole US Senate would be different. And their concerns would be different. Their questions for someone like Kavanaugh would be different. The way they look at treaties would be different. It wouldn't be so much about ideology as much as it would be about what's best for the state and what's best for the union. That would be the natural way of looking at it if they represented their states rather than they were democratically elected, a populace who democratically elected them. I guess that's the way to say it. Okay? All right, let's continue on.
When you say ideologies, what do you mean ideologies?
Conservative, liberal, socialist, utopianist, libertarian, whatever it is. Before the senators were voted in by the people, it didn't really matter what party the senators were. Their greatest concern was going to be keeping that legislature happy. And a state legislature, the best way to keep them happy is to keep their state protected. Therefore, it's going to be less federal influence against the state. You'll notice that prior to 1913, if you look back in history, a lot of these internal laws, there were some going on, but not like it is now. But for the most part, federal intrusion into state issues was at a minimum. The moment the 17th Amendment was in place, and after Coolidge was president and Roosevelt got in there, he took advantage, man, and the internal issues were completely ravaged by federal regulations and laws and so on and so forth. So I truly believe that the senators being appointed by the state legislatures really kept the federal government from intruding into state issues, because ideology didn't matter. It wasn't about leftism or republicanism or utopianism or whatever. All that mattered to these senators was keeping their legislature happy, and the state legislature, all they wanted was for the federal government to stay out of their damn business. See what I'm saying? That was the primary concern. Ideology, they didn't really care. Stay out of our business. That was the concern. Now, our senators could care less if the federal government's getting into the state's business. If anything now, especially with the lefties, they want federal intrusion into state business. So we got the opposite effect because of 17th Amendment, in my opinion. All right, so let's read this in full now. So now I've explained all this, it might make a little more sense. He shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So when it comes to treaties, it requires 2/3. That's a big number too, isn't it? And he shall nominate, he being the president, and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not hereby otherwise provided for. These will be basically the senior officers. Senior officers would need to be nominated and approved by Senate. So let's stop there now. Is Robert Mueller a senior officer? He sure acts like one. I think in the eyes of government, he is a senior officer. I think he should have been confirmed by the Senate, and he wasn't. He has an awful lot of power for a minor officer. He has an awful lot to say for a minor officer. Should he have not been confirmed by the Senate? He has an awful lot of power for someone who didn't get confirmed by Senate. The whole point of the confirmation process is so that if there's a power structure going on, the states have a say. So wait a second, you're doing what here? No, that's too much power. But states don't have that voice anymore, do they? And since there's ideology there, and there's a bunch of leftists there, well, good God, who knows what the limit is when it comes to what they'll be willing to approve. Of course, these people are so civil, they're willing to claw at doors while the confirmation, after the confirmation, while the guy's getting sworn in.
So it was on the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson's kicking back and the light bulb goes off in his head when he sees two treaties?
Yeah,
That's how I can do it.
that's how I can do it. Essentially, yeah.
But he's
And-
gotta
and-
convince
and-
2/3 of the Senate present.
Yeah,
It's a good idea.
yeah. So
what
I
was
mean,
in it for them?
but he was kicking himself because it was kind of messed up. He found a way to go against the Constitution through a constitutional route.
Well, how to get the 2/3 vote?
He got it.
It's good
Hey,
stuff.
they knew the Louisiana Purchase was a good deal too.
Well, how did the states benefit from it?
They really didn't because the territory wasn't given to them, but the senators approved it because doubling the size of the United States. You got to remember also, there was a doctrine that was believed at that time that was first starting to emerge. It really didn't finish emerging until Monroe, of manifest destiny.
Mm.
You ever heard of that? Manifest
Yeah.
destiny? You know what that means, Chris?
Was it,
George.
The destiny that we will be from sea to shining
Yeah.
sea. It was America's destiny to get it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And that was a great big chunk in that direction. It was really that was that belief, and it kind of confirmed that belief. And
We even
plus
said,
also France was kind of a pain in the butt anyway, being there.
you said that the states already went to the Pacific, like Connecticut went all the way to them.
Well, they didn't, because they went to the edge of the Louisiana Purchase.
Okay.
But see but now, I'm glad you brought up that point. What he's talking about, there's a map that I like to show, and I'm not gonna go look it up, I'll just give you a slight illustration. If you go back and look at the maps of the frontier and the states prior to the Louisiana Purchase, you got the, East Coast coastline here, right? So you got your different states. I'm a horrible drawer, but anyway, their borders would just kind of head arbitrarily eastward, or westward, I mean. And Connecticut would have to have like this little one right here. It was kind of funny, because the territories that were between the original states and the edge of France's property was American, and the states took claim to it. It was the states' territories. Now, what wound up happening is you got Virginia, and then this was their land, and then the area of Kentucky started getting populated, and Kentucky decided it didn't want to be a part of Virginia, so they actually applied as a state separate from Virginia. But yeah, the lines just kind of went arbitrarily west, just straight lines, because it was state territory. But you don't see that after the Louisiana Purchase. So the federal government started taking control of all this properties, and then you got the Louisiana Purchase that did that. So you got all this land. The states didn't get that land. That was federal property. Federal government wasn't supposed to own property like that because the federal government wasn't there to own property. It was there to handle external issues and protect the union, not to be a centralized nationalistic system.
is that why like Obama and all them, they
They hate colonialism.
yeah, they take the land and all that, all the way from like, up there in Barstow.
Oh,
They took it all the way
okay.
up
Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Are national parks constitutional?
No.
No. They just took that land. How dare they? Let me ask you this. If that land under that state, and the federal government has no right to any of that land unless they purchase it with the consent of the state legislature for the purpose of needful buildings, like a
Yeah.
post office, like a military base with military buildings on it, something like that. Otherwise, the land is none of their business. So if that's the case in the state, and that's the state's property, how come the states have to apply for permits to drill like oil? If it's their mineral, because that's their mineral rights in it, right?
Yeah.
State. So what belongs to the state on the surface should belong to the state up and down too, right? So how come they gotta ask the federal government to drill? They shouldn't have to. The federal government's not there to regulate them. The federal government was created to protect, promote, and preserve the union, handle those external issues, to handle disputes between the states, stuff like that.
But that goes back to our properties. You don't own any oil or gold or whatever below the surface on your property.
Why not?
These have already sold it.
Yeah, well, it should be yours. In fact, the way it works, a friend of mine's actually going through this, because there is one group that does own Native Americans, Indians. I have a friend of mine who's half Native American. His father, who was full-blooded Indian, passed away, and he left him these different properties. And the federal government, because technically this is part of the reservation, this isn't American property. And now this American, who's half Indian, owns this property, but it's still considered Indian land. So the federal government has just, and different companies have discovered there might be oil under this land.
Mhm.
So so they're kind of schmooze him, because they can't just expect him to get permits. They gotta get his permission. And they gotta pay him for it.
Don't
It's a whole different animal when it comes to the Indians.
Don't sign anything.
Don't sign anything. Well, and the thing is, and the Indian, the way they looked at it also brings up an interesting point. I want to bring up a question I was asked. I was in Laguna Woods last week for an Act for America group. This is off topic, but it's kind of along the lines of what we're talking about. The 14th Amendment, like in the First Amendment, Section 2, for First Amendment, Article 1, Section 2, like the 14th Amendment, says that for the House, the census determines how many members of the House the state has, right? Okay, now, in the census, who counts towards that apportionment? We know that citizens do, but do illegal aliens?
Do they what?
Do illegal aliens count towards the census number for the apportionment in the House?
Migrants.
Okay, let's read it real quick.
They're not supposed to.
Not supposed to, and that would be my immediate answer too.
But they
And
do.
then we got to reading this, and I really had to pull a rabbit out of my hindquarters to pull this one off to make him understand, because that is right, but because we have to remember they didn't really have a problem with illegal aliens back then, so we have to go by what they knew and what language they used. All right, so 14th Amendment, Section 2, so 26, page 26. Okay. Here's what it says. Representatives shall be apportioned. In other words, how many representatives each state gets. It's on page 26, section 2. Among the several states according to their respective numbers. Okay, so we know that much. Counting the whole number of persons in each state. It used to be the whole numbers of free persons, remember? And then you had the 3/5 clause. So this eliminates the 3/5 clause. So the whole number of persons, doesn't say citizens or non-citizens, legal or not legal, it says persons. Okay, so the whole number of persons. Then it says excluding Indians not taxed. Excluding Indians not taxed. So from that, we have to figure out whether or not illegal aliens should be counted towards the enumeration or the apportionment, should I say, in Congress. Excluding Indians not taxed. What's the difference between Indians taxed and not taxed? An Indian taxed is an Indian that
Is off the reservation,
off the reservation, which means he became
American citizen.
an American citizen. So Indians not taxed, in other words, it's saying people that are not citizens. Because Indians who are taxed, they aren't here. Indians not taxed, they're not a part of that. Because they're not citizens. Now, there ought to be an amendment to clarify, say, the illegal aliens is included in that Indians not taxed idea.
They still wouldn't be allowed because, back in those times, they didn't have the immigration problems that they did now.
Right, exactly. Well, that's my point. So that's why they don't say whole numbers excluding Indians not taxed and illegal aliens.
Yeah.
'Cause they didn't have that problem.
Yeah.
The problem was whether or not an Indian, the question was, well, gosh, should the Indians be counted? Well, no, because their allegiance is to their tribe, to their nation, and it's not the United States.
Their sovereignty is different.
Right, their allegiance is to a different sovereignty. Well, isn't that the same with illegal aliens?
I would say no because, oh, yeah.
Yeah, their allegiance to a different sovereignty, because they may have come here,
Yeah.
but they're still flying the Mexican
Yeah.
flag. Their allegiance isn't to us. If their allegiance was to us, they'd be following the law. Right? So my opinion, based on what it says, that Indians not taxed includes illegal aliens, or aliens not taxed. When we say not tax, not talking about sales tax, we're talking about income tax, we're talking about property tax, all that jazz. So that was my answer to him. But for clarification, yeah, I think we ought to have another amendment that says to clarify 14th Amendment, in addition to Indians not taxed, is illegal aliens not taxed. Or not directly taxed through,
Yeah.
16th Amendment or something like that.
Well, Democrats would say no because the Democrats want them to vote.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, they're Americans. We're all Americans.
Last night on the news, I heard they're migrants.
Yeah, they're poor little migrants. Oh, my favorite is when they say that we exaggerate about the danger of MS-13. Have they not been reading the news? But anyways, so that's that. I wanted to bring that up because that question was asked to me, and it's not often that someone asks me a question that kind of, it gets,
Stirs you up.
well, where I have to go, hang on a second, let me think about this. Usually I have a pretty quick answer, and that guy asked that question, I went, huh. Hang on a second. I'm looking,
Are you kidding?
and-
ISIS sent their leaders to MS-13 to learn terror tactics.
Yeah, I know, but the Democrats won't admit that. You see, you just think the MS-13 is a dangerous gang because you're a racist against Mexicans.
He's got white privilege.
Yeah, you got white privilege. Well, I tell people, they say, well, Doug, you got white privilege. You probably grew up privileged. Actually, I grew up in North Long Beach, about 3 blocks from South Compton. I was anything but white privilege.
You know what bugs me is when you got people who are white and saying white privilege. I mean, it just blows me away. You just-
Well, no, Candace Owens said that.
Yeah.
Candace Owens said, I don't get it. The white people are more prejudiced against white people.
Yeah.
Exactly. We are.
So
Crazy.
she says white liberals are so prejudiced against white people, they're not sure who they are. That's why they're trying to claim they're, Indian like Pocahontas did.
Yeah.
And it turns out she actually has less Indian in her than the average white person.
Well, it's been going on like.
And in response to that, someone sent me a meme, and it had a chicken on it that said one 20/20th bald eagle. Which I thought was hilarious. And you remember Rachel Dolezal, who thought she was black, right?
Yeah.
She was a white woman, but she claimed she was part black.
Oh, yeah.
Rachel Dolezal, remember that? And I saw a meme after her, and it said, and it had a picture of a golden lab on it. It said, "Black lab for sale. Call Rachel Dolezal." Anyway, these people, I tell you, they're almost too easy. If it wasn't so serious, it'd be hilarious.
It's crazy.
The absolute insanity. But anyway, all right. Let's get back to Article 2 and continue on. We might even finish Article 2 tonight. We got 15 minutes left. All right, so let's go to that final sentence now on where we were at. Let's go to page 12 at the very end of Article 2, Section 2, and it says, "The President shall have power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions, which shall expire at the end of their next session." That is called recess appointments. All right, so in a recess appointment, what it's saying is, Senate has the power of advise and consent. However, what's a president to do when he's got a nominee and the Senate's not in session, and he's really got to fill that position. And then back then, I mean, it could be, word get out, hey, we need you in session. It could be weeks, man. Because the horse has to get the message out to them. Then they gotta get on their horse and come back after they're finished, do their planting or whatever. It may be weeks. The president, he really needs to appoint that person. So what do we do if they're not in session? He has the power of a recess appointment where he can appoint someone without senatorial approval, but that person's appointment only lasts till the end of their next session. In other words, when they come back in session, they need to either confirm that person or he has to nominate someone else that they can confirm. Okay? Now, let's go back a little bit because there's a little bit of a memory here. I'm trying to remember here. Where was that? I think it's Article 1, Section 3, I think. Or Section 4. I think it's 4. No? It's in Article 1, Section 5. I was close. On page 4. If you want to flip over there, great. If you don't, you don't have to. Here's what it says. A majority of each house of Congress shall constitute a quorum to do business, but a smaller number may adjourn from day to day. All right, so let's say Congress does not go on recess, but they don't have enough to have a quorum. In other words, let's say it's Christmas vacation and most of them went home for Christmas and a dozen of them stayed behind. There's not enough guys to do business. They don't have a quorum, but technically they're still in session because there's still guys there pounding the gavel and doing things day to day. So what's the president to do? Well, if you're Obama, you do the recess appointment anyway, and then you tell the courts, well, you have this particular finger for them. But, and then he got in trouble for it, and those recess appointments he got reversed. He says, well, wait a second, they were on recesses. No, they weren't. They were in something called a pro forma session. What that means is they didn't go out of session. They're still in session, but they don't have enough people to have a quorum to do business. So guess what? The president says, well, I got to appoint somebody. Tough, they're still in session. But they can't do business. You're going to have to wait until they have a quorum. Why does this exist? In case there's a fear that the president will be doing things without Congress's permission. So they stay in pro forma session to basically nullify his ability to do these things while they're not in session. Like Obama, when he was recess appointing people. The whole point of them being a pro forma session so he wouldn't do that. They were still in session.
How about Wilson on the 16th?
Oh man, don't even get me started with Wilson. 16th Amendment. 16th Amendment has an interesting story behind it, and I'd rather save that for when we get to the 16th Amendment. Basically what he's getting at is, in the case of the 16th Amendment, it did not have enough ratification votes, because a couple of the states had broke their own rules in order to ratify it, so their ratification votes were null and void. Therefore, it should have fallen short a couple states. However, Wilson's Secretary of State deemed it, I think he's related to Pelosi, deemed it ratified. His name was Philander Knox. Do you think the term philanderer comes from his name? Philander Knox was the Secretary of State that did that. He deemed it ratified, even though technically it wasn't. That's enough to make you spit. That's my nice way of saying what I really want to say. I got ladies in the room. Of course, I usually don't even say Obama. I tell groups when I go out and I talk about Obama, I tell them I won't say a thing because I don't use profanity in my speeches. And they usually laugh. But I will say this. Real quick, get back to something I was talking about very early on. Man, I love Duncan Hunter. I mean, I've met him a few times. I don't know him, but I've met him. But man, that guy loves President Trump. He stands by his president. Ken Calvert's, he's a prototypical Republican. Like I said, he's not necessarily a good conservative, but he's a good Republican. That doesn't necessarily make me feel, sleep well at night. But nonetheless, he's still better than what we could have. But Duncan Hunter, man, that guy loves President Trump. He just, and Duncan Hunter, he cracked me up. He says, well, you know what? He says, our problem has been the Republican Party. So we brought a non-Republican into the presidency to get this done. And you know what? You know what I've learned from him? I'm not even sure I'm a Republican. I think I'm more like a libertarian Republican or something. And we were kind of laughing. He's like coming up with these new words. And Ken Calver's a stone face, just listening. But Duncan Hunter's like, hey man, we needed something from the outside to shake things up, and we got him. And we got to do everything we can to support our president. I'm like, man, I love this guy. But anyway, I'm feeling like Congress is not so nervous about going out of session with this president, because he wants what's best for the country, not what's best for his ideology. All right. Continue. Section 3. He shall from time to time, and by the way, the next handout, and I only have like 4 copies because I went to print and my nice little computer's been giving me fits. Well, it didn't print right. So I'll bring more next week. But most of you guys probably already have the next one in your folders, but if you don't, I do have 4 of them for the next lesson, and we're kind of going into that last executive branch lesson now. He shall from time to time give to Congress information of the State of the Union. That's our State of the Union address, right? Now let's listen carefully to what it says. And recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Recommend. He cannot legislate. He cannot order Congress to do anything, but he can recommend, he can suggest, he can say please. The president is the executive. He executes the law. The makers of law is Congress. He can suggest. He can recommend. He cannot propose.
Except Obama.
Obama is actually trying to propose law quite a bit. They can't. The president's not there to propose. Now he can make all kinds of recommendations. Hey, I want this. Republicans, write one up for me. So there was this president named John F. Kennedy, and he wanted a particular law, but he knew he couldn't write it. So he went to his Democrats. He says, "I'd really like you to write this law. It's a Civil Rights Act." You know what the Democrats told him? Pack sand.
Yeah.
So John F. Kennedy, in order to write the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and originally it was the Civil Rights Act 1963, and it got pushed to 64. He went to the Republican leadership, the Senate minority leader, and I think the Republicans also didn't have the House. I think it was the House minority leader too, but it was the 2 lead Republicans. They're the ones that helped him write the original draft of the Civil Rights Act. Then, when it went up for a vote, the Democrats were against it because it gave way too much to blacks, and they just couldn't handle that. Republicans almost 100% supported it. In fact, there were some Democrats that actually filibustered against it. One of them, his name was Al Gore Sr. But of course, they're the party of the minorities, right? Sure they are. But John F. Kennedy knew he could not write that legislation. He could recommend, say, hey guys, this is what I want, but he had to go to members of Congress for them to write it. Only they can write law and bills and propose it. Okay, so he can recommend, and that's what it's saying here. State of the Union address, and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. He may, on extraordinary occasions, time of war comes to mind, convene both houses or either of them in case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment. He may adjourn them. There has been times in the history where the fighting was so bad between the houses, the president actually adjourned them, told them to go home and sleep it off, and to come back later because it was getting so bad. There was one time, trying to remember, I think it was under Adams. I believe it was under Adams, where members of the opposition party, in order to refuse to vote for something because they didn't agree with it, they all traveled out of state and hung out at the same pub together and drank and stayed the nights at this one pub. But this says no, the president can convene them if it's necessary, if he believes it's absolutely necessary. So he actually had the marshal go out there and gather them up and bring them back. Drunk as skunks, I'm sure, but nonetheless, he brought them back to make sure they were there to vote. So the president can make sure they get into session or adjourn, but it has to be extraordinary instances. It has to be one of those situations where it's an emergency situation, but guess what? That's kind of up to his discretion, and we expect our presidents to be, you know, men of character and ethics, and and considering the last president, that's almost comical to say. All right. He shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers. All right, so you know, like they have the White House dinners and things like that. That's part of that. Now here's the one that really catches my attention, and we've talked about this language a little bit last week too. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Capital C,
Faithfully.
capital
That's
L.
a powerful word, man.
We have capital C, capital L.
Unless some tyrannical judge tries to stop him.
He shall take care,
Capital C.
capital C, emphasis on that word, that the laws be faithfully executed. Faithfully, yeah, that's a powerful word. That's also kind of a religious word, isn't it? What do you think they meant by faithfully in this context?
Without waiver.
I didn't think it was.
Without waver,
Get her done.
get her done, with his heart and soul,
Yep.
and full faith in what it stands for and the American system. They wanted our presidents to be patriots who faithfully, because they were patriots, executed the law. That's what was best for America. Yes, sir.
Well, then, should our presidents not have to know the Constitution before they become
It
president?
should. Well, we had a constitutional scholar for our last president, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Crack show.
Isn't that what they said?
He was a scholar.
It was hilarious because,
He didn't follow it.
I was talking politics right after Obama was elected. I was at a automobile repair shop, and I can't remember what I was getting done to my car, but I was in the lobby waiting room, and this guy had recognized me as the Constitution guy. We got talking, man. We're talking Constitution. He's asking me all kinds of questions, and there's this woman, and I hadn't really noticed her. In hindsight, later, I realized that her shirt was I can't remember if it was a Black Lives Matter shirt, it was something of those,
Oh my God.
whatever. But anyway, and so we're talking, and she's listening, and she finally pipes up, she says, well, you must be really excited we have a constitutional scholar professor as our president. I said, ma'am, I know the Constitution, and that guy's no constitutionalist. Now that said, here's why they say he's a constitutional professor. At the University of Chicago, and by the way, I talked about this in my latest book. I have a whole chapter about this. Or it's included in the chapter, a whole chapter about him. He basically taught how to use the 14th Amendment to create racial division. And that's his constitutional prowess. That pretty much sums the guy up, don't it? She huffed and puffed and didn't want to talk to me anymore. It's funny how that happens.
Truth.
mean she didn't shout at you?
They weren't in resist mode yet.
Oh.
This was, this is 10 years ago. Right after he got elected. Yeah, they're in resist mode now. I probably would have my eyes clawed out and my leg broken, nowadays. Animals. All right. And he shall commission all the officers of the United States. And finally, the very, very last sentence, and then we'll say goodnight. The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Remember, impeachment does not mean removal from office. Impeachment means to be charged or indicted for misconduct. But it's saying here that if they are impeached, and those are the reasons, removal from office is the only sentence that should be allowed, or will be allowed. Impeachment doesn't have to result in removal from office, but if it's one of these things, treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, they will be removed from office. What's a high crime?
Be like a felony now?
Felony? Is that what you
You
think
mean
it
like
is?
dropping
Okay.
off money?
What else is a high crime?
Dropping off money in Iran?
Dropping off
On a
money.
Billions of cash.
What else is a high crime?
Giving guns to
Cocaine traffic?
to Mexico, to the drug
Yeah.
cartel?
I love this group.
Fast and Furious?
Alright, so what you're saying is a high crime, it means a worse crime than normal.
Yep.
That's not what they meant. A high crime is any crime by a high official.
Oh my God, we gotta get rid of the whole swamp.
A high crime is any crime by a high official. It's a high crime because they are a high official.
We gotta get rid of all of them.
High crime.
We the people.
Yeah, talk about draining the swamp, huh? Alright, we will start with Article 3 next week. Now, I do have the lesson that we just went over tonight, which I think is, was it 7 or, let's see here. Yeah, number 7, faithfully execute, and there's 1 left, 2 left, 1 left. So if you didn't get one, there's 1 left. I'll bring more next week just in case you didn't get one, you wanted one. But next week is a whole new handout. Article 3 is what branch? See,
Judicial.
Judicial. Article 1 is legislative, Article 2 is executive, Article 3 is judicial branch. That's right, next week we're gonna start talking about the judges, oh joy.
Woohoo!
Yes, sir.
Have you heard anything? I just got this in my,
Skip, you mind grabbing the bucket for me?
I just got this in my email today from the Tea Party. They're saying that the Democrats have set up their own war room to impeach Trump with their own articles of impeachment. And they're doing that with Al Green and Steve Cohen.
Al Green was one of the guys I sent the pocket constitution to.
Do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that. Doesn't surprise me though.
Their own war room?
Their own war room because the problem is they don't operate constitutionally, they operate and hate anything that opposes their agenda mode. But see, the Republicans in the past, this goes back to what I was saying about Duncan Hunter. The Republicans in the past were essentially spineless and they all drank from the same trough. They may not have drank as often from the trough, but they did. The Democrats knew they could twist, they could get the Republicans to work with them at least a little bit. Get them to drink from the trough just a tad, and then they could blackmail them or whatever. Okay?
Drink the Kool-Aid.
Here comes Donald J. Trump.
I love
He don't drink from the trough. He ain't part of the system. In fact, he kicked the damn trough over. They don't know what to do with the guy. That's why they're freaking out. Because at least the Republicans, they can kind of push him in a direction. They don't know what to do with this guy. He's not only outside the Kavanaugh thing, any other Republican president and any other nominee would have said, okay, this is too much. I can't do this. My family is under attack. And that's what they wanted. But see, Trump and apparently Kavanaugh have cojones of steel, right? And what's interesting is you've noticed that it's starting to give the other Republicans a sense of a spine. I never thought I would say I was proud of Lindsey Graham.
Yeah.
I especially never thought I'd say I'm proud of Susan Collins.
Oh, I know.
Mitch McConnell.
Mitch McConnell. These guys, suddenly a spine has well, in the case of Lindsey Graham, I think it's twofold. I think it's number one, Trump's rubbing off on him a little bit, and also now John McCain's gone, so he can't influence him negatively. I think there's a little bit of both going on,
Man in
don't
the
you?
swamp.
Yeah, those girly guys' voice went from a tenor to a baritone.
Yeah, no, I tell you what, and I've said this before, it goes back to what my friend Alex said on the radio show. I may not have gotten the president I wanted, but it turned out America got the president it needed.
Yeah.
And this president, I'm gonna tell you what, and I want to do a list to make sure I really get it out there. He is more constitutional than any president since Coolidge.
I believe that.
I mean, he's even got Reagan beat, and that's hard for me to say because I'm a Reagan baby. My first presidential vote was for Reagan. I consider myself a Reagan baby. Absolutely love Ronald Reagan. Trump is blowing Reagan out of the water with his constitutionality and his conservatism.
Did you hear what he told Honduras? They're sending a bunch of Hondurans
Oh,
over
yeah, the
here.
Honduras.
Yeah, and they-
Caravan.
Yeah, and then
Yeah, I
they were
heard
getting
about
mad.
Caravan, yeah.
Yeah, and he said that Trump said that if Honduras sends them over, doesn't stop them. They ain't getting no more aid, they ain't getting no money, they ain't getting nothing.
Yeah.
Good,
Yeah.
oh, good.
Well, see, and the Republicans are cheering that, and the Democrats are afraid of that because you know what Trump has shown us? Sanctions work.
Yeah.
Look at Iran getting nervous. Look what North Korea did.
Yeah.
It's amazing what sanctions will do.
Well, he had to rattle North Korea's cage.
Well, see, we have the most powerful economy in the world, and the Democrats don't like that. They want to knock us down a few steps. Trump's like, no. That great economy that we have, us being a strong economy and a powerful, that means we are the big stick. He's not just carrying the big stick. He's realized we are the big stick. And when you operate from a position of strength, people listen.
Yeah, he's a big horn sheep in the pig pen.
They said there,
And then the Democrats said, well, he's such a bully. No, he's got a firm hand.
they said there was this guy
Grow up.
in Turkey for 20 or I don't know how many years, and he had been praying for Trump, and he says Trump's the one that's going to get me out, and he said he was praying, and Trump got
You're
him
talking
out.
about Brunson, this
Yeah.
recent
He
pastor?
got out of prison.
Well, not only that, but there is a guy who's originally from Iran. He was an official from Iran. He was under the Shah and came to the United States. And he said because of Trump, Iran, it may be getting ready to experience its own 1776. Now that said, that meant a lot to me because our are we still on?
Yes.
I wanna say something that I can't go on with. So you guys, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week. Adios.
All right. See you next time around, 6 o'clock, California time, PM.